A billionaire's black cleaner discovers a hidden safe containing a letter that stuns him. What shocking secret will this document unveil, and how will it impact their relationship? And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The early morning light filtered through the mansion's windows as Jamal pushed his cleaning cart down the marble hallway. His weathered hands gripped the handle with practiced ease, navigating the familiar corridors of the Beverly Hills estate where he had worked for the past 7 years. The mansion's grandeur never failed to remind him of the vast divide between his world and that of its wealthy inhabitants. Jamal's morning routine started the same way it always did. He began in the main foyer, methodically working his way through the mansion's expansive rooms. His movements were efficient, refined by years of experience, but his mind wandered to thoughts of his family. His daughter needed braces, and his son's school had announced another increase in tuition fees. The weight of these financial pressures pressed heavily on his shoulders as he worked. In the West Wing's executive office, Jamal noticed something unusual while dusting behind an oversized painting of the late Richard Morrison, the tech billionaire who had owned the mansion. The wall seemed hollow when he tapped it. After years of cleaning every inch of this house, this detail had somehow escaped his attention. Jamal's curiosity got the better of his usual professional restraint. He carefully moved the painting aside, revealing a small electronic keypad partially hidden behind the frame. The discovery should have prompted him to alert security or the house manager, but something made him hesitate. He remembered the code he had seen Sarah Morrison, Richard's daughter, punch into her phone countless times when he cleaned her office, her father's birthday. Acting on instinct, Jamal entered the numbers. A soft click echoed through the room as a panel in the wall slid open, revealing a simple steel safe. Inside the safe, Jamal found a single envelope, yellowed with age, addressed simply to the truth seeker. His hands trembled as he opened it, knowing he was crossing a line that could cost him his job. The letter inside was written in careful handwriting, dated 15 years ago. To whoever finds this letter, if you're reading this, you've discovered something I've kept hidden for decades. My name is Richard Morrison, and I've lived a life of success by most measures, but success often comes with its share of regrets. There's one regret that has haunted me more than any other, a story that involves a woman named Maria Santos. Maria was not just any woman. She was brilliant, passionate, and deserved far more than the hand life dealt her. We met when she worked as a research assistant in my first tech startup, long before I became who I am today. She saw potential in my ideas when no one else did, and her insight was instrumental in developing the technology that would eventually make me billions. But Maria had a secret of her own. She was pregnant. She never told me who the father was, and I never asked. What I did was worse. I pushed her away when the company started taking off, afraid that her presence would complicate the clean, corporate image I was trying to build. She left without a fight, taking with her not just her brilliant mind, but also the child who would never know how close they came to a different life. Jamal's hands shook as he read the name Maria Santos, his mother's name. The room seemed to spin around him as pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed started falling into place. His mother, who had always worked as a housekeeper like him, who had raised him alone, telling him his father had died before he was born. The same mother who had insisted he apply for this specific job at this specific mansion 7 years ago. The letter continued, but Jamal could barely focus on the words. His entire understanding of his life, his identity, and his place in this world shifted fundamentally in those few moments. The rich wood-paneled office, which he had cleaned countless times before, suddenly felt foreign and overwhelming. He thought about all the times he had dusted Richard Morrison's photograph, never knowing he might be staring into the face of a man who had known his mother, who might have. Jamal couldn't complete the thought. He carefully folded the letter and placed it in his pocket, his movements mechanical and uncertain. The morning light that had seemed so ordinary just moments ago now felt harsh and exposing. He had started his day as a simple cleaner, content with his place in the world despite its hardships. Now, standing in the office of a dead billionaire, he found himself at the beginning of a story he never knew was his to tell. Sarah Morrison stood at the window of her father's former office, staring at the sprawling Los Angeles landscape below. The morning news played on her tablet, another story about her father's legacy in the tech industry. These stories always painted Richard Morrison as a visionary, a self-made billionaire who transformed the digital landscape. But Sarah knew better. She had seen the cracks in his carefully constructed public image, the late-night phone calls he never explained, and the grief that seemed to follow him even in his most successful moments. The sound of her brother Thomas's voice down the hall made her tense involuntarily. Since their father's death 3 months ago, Thomas had become increasingly aggressive about taking control of Morrison Technologies. Sarah watched him stride past her office, speaking sharply into his phone about board meetings and voting shares. The conversation she'd overheard last night still echoed in her mind, Thomas discussing with the company's lawyers how to consolidate his power and potentially force her out of her position as co-heir. Sarah pulled up the company's financial records on her computer, documents she'd been reviewing obsessively since discovering irregularities in some of her father's personal accounts. Thomas had already begun making moves to restrict her access to certain files, but he didn't know about the backup copies she'd made. The transactions she found painted a curious picture: regular payments to an offshore account spanning over 2 decades, stopping only a month before their father's death. The annual Morrison Foundation Gala provided an unwelcome but necessary distraction from her investigation. Sarah made her way through the mansion's grand ballroom, nodding at board members and family friends who had gathered to celebrate her father's philanthropic legacy. She noticed Thomas holding court near the bar, carefully cultivating his image as the natural successor to their father's empire. The evening was proceeding as these events usually did until Sarah noticed something unusual. The cleaning staff member working near the refreshment table caught her attention, not because he was doing anything wrong, but because of the way he looked at her father's portrait. There was an intensity in his gaze that seemed out of place, a hint of something that went beyond mere curiosity. Sarah approached him, noticing how he quickly tried to busy himself with arranging glasses. "I've seen you around the house before," she said, keeping her voice low to avoid drawing attention. "You're Jamal, right?" He nodded, and Sarah noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he continued his work. Something about his demeanor struck her as familiar. It reminded her of how she felt when she first discovered the inconsistencies in her father's records, that same mix of uncertainty and barely contained revelation. "My father," Sarah said, gesturing to the portrait, "he was good at keeping secrets. Sometimes I think I barely knew him at all." She watched Jamal's reaction carefully, noting how he seemed to freeze for a moment before continuing his task. "Ms. Morrison," Jamal finally spoke, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. "Your father left behind more than just his company." He hesitated, then added, "I found something in his office that might interest you." Before Sarah could respond, Thomas appeared beside them, his presence as intrusive as always. "Sarah, the board members are asking for you." His eyes flickered to Jamal with barely concealed disdain. "And shouldn't you be cleaning somewhere else?" Sarah watched Jamal retreat, but not before their eyes met in a moment of silent understanding. She recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same one she saw in the mirror every morning, the look of someone carrying the weight of an unspoken truth. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Thomas had finally left for his penthouse downtown, Sarah found herself back in her father's office. She stood before his portrait, remembering Jamal's words and his reaction to her father's image. Something was hidden here, something that connected this seemingly ordinary cleaning staff member to her father's carefully guarded past. Sarah pulled out her phone and began composing an email to the head of house staff, requesting Jamal's personnel file. As she typed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to uncover something that would change everything she thought she knew about her father, her family, and the empire he had built. The memory of his mother's stories flooded back to Jamal as he sat in his modest apartment kitchen, the letter from Richard Morrison burning a hole in his pocket. He remembered Sunday afternoons when he was 10, his mother recounting tales of her younger days while preparing their weekly family dinner. Maria Santos had always spoken of a time when she worked in technology, but her stories seemed like far-fetched dreams to young Jamal, especially as he watched her return home exhausted from cleaning houses day after day. One particular memory stood out now, sharp and clear in his mind. His mother sitting at their old kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee while describing a revolutionary piece of software she had helped develop. At the time, Jamal had dismissed it as the imagination of a woman who wanted her son to dream bigger than their circumstances allowed. Now, every detail of those conversations took on new meaning. "We were going to change the world," she had said, her eyes distant. Sometimes the smallest piece of code can make the biggest difference. Young Jamal had nodded, more interested in his homework than his mother's reminiscences. But there had been other clues he'd missed. The way she religiously followed Morrison Technologies' developments, her insistence that Jamal learn computer programming despite their limited resources, and her mysterious smile whenever Richard Morrison appeared on television. The drive to his mother's small house in East Los Angeles felt longer than usual. Jamal gripped the steering wheel, rehearsing what he would say. The letter sat in his jacket pocket, its weight seemingly growing with each mile. When he arrived, Maria was tending to her small garden, her gray-streaked hair tucked under a worn sun hat. She straightened up when she saw him, her smile fading as she registered his expression. "You know," she said simply, before he could speak. They stood in her tiny backyard, the evening air heavy with unspoken words. Jamal pulled out the letter, and Maria's hands trembled as she took it. "Was this why you wanted me to work at the mansion?" Jamal's voice carried years of questions he hadn't known he needed to ask. "Did you know about the letter? About the safe?" Maria sank into one of her plastic garden chairs, the letter clutched to her chest. "I knew Richard had left something," she admitted, "but I didn't know what. I couldn't bring myself to look when I cleaned his office all those years ago." The revelation hit Jama like a physical blow. "You worked at the mansion too? When?" "Before you were born." Maria's voice was barely a whisper. "After I left the company, Richard, he made sure I always had work, even if he couldn't openly acknowledge why." She looked up at her son, tears forming in her eyes. "I never told you everything, because I wanted to protect you. The truth about your father. Is Richard Morrison my father?" Jamal interrupted, the question he'd been afraid to ask finally breaking free. Maria's silence spoke volumes. She stood up, moving toward the house. "Come inside. There's something I need to show you." In her small bedroom, she pulled out an old shoebox from under her bed. Inside were photographs, letters, and what looked like early design documents for what would become Morrison Technologies' first successful product. "Your father was a good man," Maria began, but Jamal cut her off. "Which one? The man who raised me until I was 5, the one you said died? Or Richard Morrison, the billionaire who kept you cleaning houses your entire life?" Maria flinched at his tone. "It's complicated, Jamal. The choices I made. Were they really your choices?" Jamal's voice cracked with emotion. "Or were they his? Did he push you away to protect his image? His company?" The words from Richard's letter echoed in his mind. "I chose to protect you," Maria said firmly. "From the press, from the speculation, from growing up in the shadow of a man who couldn't acknowledge you. Richard offered to help financially, but I wanted you to know the value of hard work, to build your own path." Jamal paced the small room, decades of half-truths and careful omissions unraveling around him. "And now? Why didn't you tell me when he died? When I started working at the mansion?" "Because you needed to find your own way to the truth," Maria replied, her voice stronger now. "Richard and I agreed long ago that if you were ever to know, it had to be your discovery. But there's more to this story than what's in that letter, Jamal. Much more." The tension between them grew as silence filled the room. Jamal looked at his mother, really looked at her, seeing for the first time not just the woman who had raised him, but a person with her own complex past, her own struggles and secrets. The anger he'd felt beginning to bubble up gave way to a deeper need to understand. "Tell me everything," he said finally, sitting down on the edge of her bed. "From the beginning. No more protection, no more secrets. I need to know who I am." Maria nodded slowly, reaching for the box of memories she'd kept hidden for so long. As she began to speak, Jamal realized that the truth he discovered in Richard Morrison's office was just the beginning of a much larger story. The Morrison Technologies executive boardroom became the unlikely meeting place for Sarah and Jamal's first real conversation. Sarah had arranged for him to access the building under the pretense of a special cleaning assignment. The room's floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Los Angeles, a stark contrast to the intimate nature of their discussion. Sarah spread out the documents she'd gathered on the polished mahogany table: bank statements, old company records, and photographs from the company's early days. Jamal placed Richard's letter alongside them, creating a timeline of connections neither had fully understood before. In one photograph from 1995, Richard stood proudly in front of the company's first office, and there in the background, partially visible but unmistakable, was Maria Santos. "My father kept detailed records of everything," Sarah explained, pointing to a series of transactions. "These payments to an offshore account started the same month your mother left the company. They continued for over 20 years, until just before his death. But there's something else." She pulled out another document, a legal agreement dated 1995. This contains a clause about intellectual property GHTS, specifically crediting someone named MS for foundational code in our first software release. Jamal studied the document, his mind racing. "My mother used to talk about code she'd written, algorithms she'd developed. I always thought she was just dreaming, trying to give me something to aspire to. But she was telling the truth." Their investigation led them to track down former employees from Morrison Technologies' early days. Most had moved on to other companies or retired, but a few remained in the area. However, each attempt to make contact was mysteriously thwarted. Scheduled meetings were canceled at the last minute, emails went unanswered, and phone calls were redirected. The pattern became clear when Sarah received a call from Jerome Porter, one of the company's original programmers. "I'm sorry, Ms. Morrison," he said, his voice tense. "But your brother made it clear that discussing the company's early days would be considered a violation of our non-disclosure agreements. He's threatening legal action." The annual Morrison Technologies board meeting brought matters to a head. Thomas had arranged for a vote on restructuring the company's leadership, effectively consolidating power under his control. Sarah sat at the far end of the boardroom table, watching her brother command the room with practiced charm. Jamal waited outside, having provided Sarah with additional documents his mother had finally shared. "Before we vote," Sarah interrupted Thomas's carefully prepared presentation, "I think we need to address some discrepancies in the company's history." She began distributing copies of the documents she and Jamal had gathered. "Our father built this company on brilliant technology, but he didn't create it alone. There's evidence suggesting that a key contributor was deliberately erased from our company's story." Thomas's facade cracked for just a moment before he recovered. "My sister seems to have been misled by a disgruntled former employee," he announced smoothly. "These accusations are not only baseless, but potentially damaging to our father's legacy. I move to have these documents stricken from the record." "These aren't accusations, Thomas," Sarah countered, her voice steady. "These are facts. Facts that you've been working very hard to keep hidden. Why is that? What else are you trying to protect besides father's legacy?" The tension in the room became palpable as Thomas's expression darkened. "Security," he called out sharply. "Please escort Ms. Morrison and her source from the building. And make sure they understand that sharing confidential company information has serious consequences." As security approached, Sarah gathered the documents quickly. She met Jamal in the hallway, both of them hurrying toward the elevators. "He's scared," she said under her breath. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than just your mother's role in the company's founding." Jamal nodded, thinking of his mother's words about there being more to the story. "Thomas isn't just protecting your father's legacy or his position in the company. He's protecting himself. The question is, from what?" They reached Sarah's car in the underground parking garage, both aware that this confrontation had escalated their search for the truth into something more dangerous. Thomas had shown his hand. He wasn't just trying to maintain control. He was willing to destroy anyone who threatened to expose the past. Sarah started the engine, her mind racing with possibilities. "We need to find out what happened in 1995, what really drove my father to push your mother away." And we need to understand what Thomas's role is in all of this. He would have been just a teenager then, but somehow he's tied to this. I can feel it. As they drove away from Morrison Technologies, neither spoke for several minutes, each processing the implications of what had just happened. Their search for truth had become a battle for justice, and they were now firmly on the same side. The vintage Craftsman house in Pasadena served as Sarah's refuge from the corporate world of Morrison Technologies. She had purchased it with her own money, earned from investments separate from her family's wealth. It was here that she and Jamal found themselves one evening, surrounded by papers and photographs spread across her dining room table. Their investigation temporarily paused for a moment of honest conversation. Sarah poured 2 cups of tea, the steam rising in the dim light of her antique table lamp. "I always thought I knew who my father was," she began, settling into a chair across from Jamal. "Brilliant, distant, complicated, but fundamentally good. Now I'm questioning everything, including who I am. The company, the wealth, the privilege, it all feels tainted somehow." Jamal wrapped his hands around the warm cup, thinking about his own identity crisis. "At least you grew up knowing your place in the world, even if it wasn't perfect. I spent my whole life thinking I was one person, only to discover I might be someone else entirely. My mother worked so hard, made so many sacrifices. I used to think it was just our lot in life, but now I know she chose it. She chose that life for both of us." The silence between them felt comfortable, understanding. Sarah studied Jamal's face, seeing traces of her father that she hadn't noticed before, the same thoughtful furrow of the brow, the same analytical gaze. "Do you resent her, your mother, for keeping the truth from you?" "I want to," Jamal admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "But then I think about my own kids. Elena is 12, Marcus is 9. Every decision I make, every extra shift I take, every dream I put on hold, it's all for them. My mother did the same for me. She didn't just hide the truth. She protected me from becoming something I might not have been ready to be." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes intense. "But what about now? You're ready now. You have children of your own who could benefit from their grandfather's legacy. Don't they deserve to know their true heritage?" The question hit Jamal hard. He stood up, walking to Sarah's window that overlooked her carefully tended garden. "What is true heritage? Money? Power? Or is it the values you learn, the person you become? My children know what it means to work hard, to earn everything they have, just like I learned from my mother. Would Richard Morrison's money make their lives better, or just different?" "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Sarah pointed out gently. "You can maintain your values while accepting your birthright. Look at me. I have access to everything Thomas is trying to deny you, but I'm still fighting for the truth. Money doesn't have to change who you are." Jamal turned back to face her, his expression troubled. "But it always does, doesn't it? Look at Thomas. Whatever turned him into what he is now, I'm willing to bet it had something to do with growing up with all of this." He gestured to encompass the comfortable home, the privilege it represented. Sarah stood up abruptly, her tea forgotten. "Thomas is planning something. His behavior at the board meeting, the way he's trying to consolidate power, it's not just about maintaining control. He's afraid. When people with power are afraid, they become dangerous." "Are you scared?" Jamal asked, watching her carefully. "Not for myself," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "But I'm worried about what he might do to protect himself. We're threatening everything he's built his identity around. People like Thomas, they don't just fight back, they destroy their opponents completely." Jamal moved closer, his presence reassuring. "Maybe that's why this is so important. It's not just about uncovering the truth anymore. It's about standing up to people who think their power gives them the right to bury it." Sarah found herself studying Jamal's face again, seeing not just her father's features now, but something uniquely his own, a quiet strength. An unshakable integrity. "We need to be careful," she said finally. "Thomas has resources, connections. He won't hesitate to use them against us." "I know," Jamal replied, thinking of his children, his mother, everything he had to lose. "But we've come too far to back down now. Whatever the truth is, Whatever it costs to uncover it, I need to know. We both do. They spent the rest of the evening planning their next moves, aware that every step they took brought them closer to a confrontation that could change all their lives forever. Outside, the Pasadena night grew deeper, and somewhere across the city, Thomas Morrison was undoubtedly planning his own next moves in this high-stakes game of truth and power. The basement archives of Morrison Technologies housed decades of company history in rows of carefully labeled boxes. Using Sarah's access code, Jamal spent his evening shift methodically searching through documents from the mid-1990s. He had convinced the night security guard that he was conducting a special cleaning project authorized by Ms. Morrison, buying himself precious hours of uninterrupted research. In a box marked Initial Patent Applications, 1995, Jamal discovered something remarkable. The original documentation for Morrison Technologies' breakthrough software included detailed technical notes written in two distinct handwriting styles. He recognized Richard Morrison's precise script from the letter, but the second handwriting made his heart skip a beat. It matched his mother's exactly. The notes described a revolutionary approach to data compression, the very technology that had launched Morrison Technologies into the stratosphere of tech companies. As Jamal dug deeper, he found a newspaper clipping from 1995 that captured his attention. The article covered a tech conference in San Francisco where Richard Morrison had presented the company's groundbreaking software. In the accompanying photograph, Richard stood at a podium, but what caught Jamal's eye was the crowd. His mother sat in the front row, her expression a complex mixture of pride and pain. Next to her sat a teenage boy Jamal didn't recognize, but whose features bore a striking resemblance to Thomas Morrison. A series of internal memos from the same period revealed increasing pressure from potential investors who wanted assurance about the company's intellectual property rights. One memo, marked confidential, detailed a meeting where concerns were raised about the company's ability to go public with disputed ownership of key technologies. The memo ended with a cryptic note, resolution achieved through mutual agreement. T situation handled permanently. Jamal photographed everything with trembling hands, his mind racing to connect the dots. He began to reconstruct a timeline, the tech conference, the investor concerns, his mother's sudden departure from the company, and the beginning of those regular offshore payments. Something significant had happened at that conference, something that had set all of these events in motion. Meanwhile, Sarah had been conducting her own investigation, reviewing her father's personal diaries from the period. She sat in her home office, poring over volumes of Richard's private thoughts. The entries from 1995 revealed a man torn between ambition and conscience. One passage particularly stood out. Maria's contribution to the compression algorithm is fundamental. The entire system relies on her innovative approach. But the board is right. A company built on shared patents, especially with her background and status, would never attract the major investors we need. I tell myself I'm protecting her by keeping her name off the patents, by arranging the private compensation. But in my heart, I know I'm protecting myself, my dreams, my future. The weight of this decision will follow me forever. The diary entries became increasingly troubled after the San Francisco conference. Richard wrote about unexpected complicat, ions, and necessary measures to protect the company's future. The word Thomas appeared several times, always in context with words like pressure and demands. Sarah closed the diary, her hands shaking. She had always known her father carried burdens, but the reality of his choices was harder to face than she had imagined. The man who had raised her, who had taught her about integrity and fairness, had betrayed those very principles at a crucial moment in his life. And somehow, Thomas was connected to it all, even as a teenager. As she processed this information, her phone buzzed with a message from Jamal. The photographs from the archives filled her screen, the patent documents, the newspaper clipping, the mysterious memo. With each image, the puzzle pieces began to shift and align, forming a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than either of them had anticipated. Sarah opened her laptop and began a search for news coverage of the 1995 San Francisco Tech Conference. She found archived video footage of her father's presentation, and as she watched, she noticed something in the background. During the Q&A session, there was a brief commotion near the front of the room. The teenage boy from the photograph, the one who looked like Thomas, could be seen leaving hurriedly, followed by Maria Santos. The camera caught Richard's face in that moment, showing a flash of barely concealed panic. The truth was emerging, but it was a truth that threatened to unravel not just the past, but the very foundation of Morrison Technology's future. Sarah realized that the story of Maria Santos and her father was more than just a tale of corporate betrayal and hidden love. It was somehow intertwined with Thomas's origins and his desperate grasp for control. The question was, how far would Thomas go to keep these secrets buried? The confrontation with Thomas took place in Richard Morrison's former home office, where everything had begun. Sarah had arranged the meeting under the pretense of discussing her withdrawal from the company, but Thomas found both her and Jamal waiting when he arrived. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the tension on everyone's faces. Thomas's initial shock at seeing Jamal quickly transformed into calculated composure. He straightened his Italian silk tie, a gesture Sarah had seen him perform countless times before difficult conversations. "I assume this is about your continued fascination with ancient company history," he said, his voice carrying a carefully measured blend of condescension and threat. Sarah placed the evidence they had gathered on their father's desk: the patent documents, the conference photographs, the internal memos, and Richard's diary entries. Thomas's eyes flickered over them, and for a moment, his composed facade cracked. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the conference photograph. "This isn't just about company history," Sarah said, watching her brother carefully. "This is about what happened in San Francisco in 1995. About why Maria Santos left the company so suddenly. About you, Thomas. We know you were there." Thomas's laugh carried no humor. "I was 15 years old in 1995. Whatever corporate drama you think you've uncovered is hardly relevant to a teenager's presence at a tech conference." But his eyes kept returning to the photograph, to his younger self sitting next to Maria Santos. Jamal stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension. "My mother remembers that conference very clearly. She remembers a conversation between you and Richard Morrison that changed everything." "What did you threaten him with, Thomas?" The question hit its mark. Thomas's composure shattered completely, replaced by something darker, more primal. "Threaten? I simply made him face reality. His brilliant partner, the woman who helped create the technology that would make him billions, was nothing more than a cleaning woman with a child. My mother had just died, and he was ready to throw everything away for his guilt over Maria Santos." The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's voice shook as she asked, "What do you mean, his guilt over Maria Santos?" Thomas's laugh turned bitter. "Haven't you figured it out yet, dear sister? Our father's relationship with Maria Santos wasn't just professional. He was going to acknowledge everything: her contribution to the company, their relationship, her son's paternity. Can you imagine? Morrison Technologies, the company I've spent my life protecting, would have become a tabloid scandal." "So you forced him to buy her silence," Sarah whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. "You, a 15-year-old boy, somehow had enough leverage over our father to make him betray someone he loved." "I protected our family's legacy," Thomas snapped. "I protected you, Sarah. Do you think growing up as Richard Morrison's acknowledged daughter would have been easier if the world knew he had a secret family? That his greatest innovation came from his affair with an immigrant programmer?" The cruelty in his words seemed to physically affect Sarah, but Jamal remained unnaturally calm. "You didn't protect anyone," he said quietly. "You destroyed something genuine to preserve something false. And you've been doing it ever since." Thomas moved with unexpected speed, snatching the documents from the desk. "None of this matters now. The statute of limitations on any patent disputes expired years ago. Maria Santos signed ironclad agreements. And you," he turned to Jamal, "are nothing more than a cleaning man who's overstepped his bounds." Sarah stepped between them. "You're wrong, Thomas. This isn't about patents or legal agreements. This is about the truth. Our father spent the rest of his life trying to make amends for the choice you forced him to make. Those payments, the job opportunities for Maria, arranging for Jamal to work here, it was all his way of trying to right a wrong. A wrong that you perpetuated, Jamal added. Every time you saw me cleaning these offices, you knew who I was. Every time you treated me like I was beneath you, you were reinforcing the lie you created when you were 15 years old. Thomas straightened, his composure returning like armor. Believe whatever you want about the past. The present is what matters. And in the present, I control Morrison Technologies. Cross me on this, Sarah, and you'll lose everything. As for you, he turned to Jamal, remember what happens to employees who violate their confidentiality agreements. As Thomas strode out of the office, Sarah and Jamal stood in stunned silence. The confrontation had revealed more than they'd expected, but it had also demonstrated just how dangerous Thomas could be. He wasn't just protecting a company secret. He was protecting the fabricated reality he'd lived in for decades. He's not going to stop, Sarah said finally. This isn't just about control anymore. It's about his entire identity. Jamal nodded, understanding that they had crossed a point of no return. Then we need to be ready for whatever he does next. Because if there's one thing I've learned from my mother, it's that the truth finds its way out, no matter how long it takes. Patricia Chun, former head of HR at Morrison Technologies, lived in a modest retirement community in Palm Springs. When Sarah and Jamal arrived at her home, they found her tending to a collection of orchids in her sunroom. At 78, she carried herself with the same professional dignity that had marked her 30-year career at the company. I've been waiting for someone to come asking about 1995, she said, gesturing for them to sit among her flowers. When I saw the news about Thomas's attempts to take control of the company, I knew it was only a matter of time before the past caught up with everyone. She regarded Jamal thoughtfully. You look just like your father when he was young. The same way of holding yourself, of watching everything carefully. Patricia revealed that she had been more than just the HR director. She had been Richard Morrison's confidant throughout the company's early years. She brought out a steel lockbox containing documents she had kept safe for decades, insurance against what she had always feared might happen. Your father had a plan, she told Jamal, removing a sealed envelope. He knew Thomas would eventually try to seize complete control, so he put safeguards in place. The regular payments to your mother weren't just compensation. They were establishing a paper trail, documenting a long-term financial relationship that could withstand legal scrutiny. Inside the envelope was a legally binding document, dated just months before Richard's death. It acknowledged Maria Santos's crucial role in developing the company's foundational technology and established a trust in Jamal's name, containing a significant portion of Morrison Technologies' original patents and associated royalties. But Thomas found out. Patricia continued, her voice heavy with regret. He discovered the trust's existence and used his position as acting CEO to freeze it before Richard's plans could be fully implemented. That's why he's been moving so aggressively to consolidate power. He's trying to bury all of this permanently. Sarah listened with growing understanding. That's why Father became so distant in his final months. He knew what Thomas was planning, but his illness prevented him from stopping it. Patricia nodded, pulling out one final document, a video recording. Richard made this the week before he died. He knew he was running out of time. She inserted a USB drive into her laptop, and Richard Morrison's face appeared on the screen, gaunt but determined. In the recording, Richard detailed everything. Maria's crucial role in developing the compression algorithm, their relationship, Thomas's discovery of their connection at the San Francisco conference, and the subsequent blackmail. Most importantly, he explained how Thomas had leveraged a dark secret from Richard's past, a financial scandal from his college days that would have destroyed his reputation and the company's future if revealed. Thomas was always clever, Richard's recorded voice explained. Even at 15, he understood power and how to use it. He didn't just want to protect our family's reputation. He wanted to ensure his place at the top. By forcing me to deny Maria and Jamal, he created a debt I could never repay. He's held it over me ever since. The recording ended with Richard looking directly into the camera. Jamal, if you're watching this, Know that my greatest regret was choosing the company over the truth. The trust one established is your birthright, but it's more than that. It's the beginning of setting things right. Sarah, my daughter, I'm trusting you to help make this happen. Together, you can correct my mistakes and prevent Thomas from turning our company into a monument to lies. As the screen went dark, the sunroom fell into silence. Patricia spoke first. I kept these safe because I knew someday someone would need to know the truth. Thomas may have frozen the trust, but he can't erase its existence. With these documents and Richard's testimony, you have everything you need to challenge his control. Jamal sat stunned, processing the weight of Richard's words and the reality of what they meant. The trust wasn't just about money or recognition. It was Richard's attempt to restore balance, to acknowledge both his professional and personal legacies. Sarah reached for her phone, her expression resolute. We need to call an emergency board meeting. With this evidence, we can force Thomas to step down and unfreeze the trust. She paused, looking at Jamal. But you understand what this means? Once we do this, everything changes. Your life, your family's life, nothing will ever be the same. Jamal thought about his children, his MOT, her, the life they had built. Maybe change is exactly what everyone needs, he said finally. Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever had their truth buried by power and privilege. As they left Patricia's home, carrying the documents that could reshape their future, both Sarah and Jamal understood that they were about to spark a transformation that would extend far beyond Morrison Technologies. They were about to challenge not just Thomas's authority, but the very systems that had allowed him to maintain his power for so long. Sarah marched into Thomas's penthouse office at Morrison Technologies the next morning, her heels clicking against the marble floors with determined precision. The wall of windows behind his desk offered a panoramic view of Los Angeles, a constant reminder of the power he wielded. Thomas looked up from his computer, his expression hardening as she dropped Patricia Chen's documents on his desk. I wondered how long it would take you to find Patricia, he said, not touching the files. Our retired HR director always did have a sentimental streak. Tell me, did she cry when she told you about Father's grand plans for his secret son? Sarah remained standing, using her height advantage to full effect. This isn't about sentiment, Thomas. This is about fraud, coercion, and 20 years of systematic abuse of power. Father's video testimony explains everything, including how a 15-year-old boy managed to blackmail his own father into betraying someone he loved. Thomas's laugh carried no warmth. Loved? Do you really think Father loved Maria Santos? He was a brilliant man with a moment of weakness. I protected him from his own worst impulses. Everything I did was for this company, for our family's legacy. You didn't protect anything, Sarah countered, her voice steady. You destroyed lives to build yourself a kingdom based on lies. But it ends now. The board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning. We're presenting everything. The original patents, Father's testimony, the trust documents, all of it. For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Thomas's face, quickly masked by anger. You have no idea what you're doing. This company, everything we've built, you're willing to risk it all for what? Some misguided sense of justice? To make a cleaning man and his mother feel better about choices they made decades ago. That cleaning man is our brother, Sarah said quietly. And his mother helped build the technology that made our family's fortune. They deserved better than what you forced Father to do. Thomas stood abruptly, his carefully maintained control cracking. I gave them exactly what they deserved, a comfortable life, far away from the complexities of our world. Do you think Jamal could have handled growing up as Richard Morrison's illegitimate son? Do you think Maria Santos could have survived the scrutiny of being the woman who helped build Morrison Technologies? I made the hard choices that Father couldn't make. Meanwhile, across the city, Jamal sat in his small living room, watching his children do their homework. Elena was working on a coding project, something that now carried new meaning given his newly discovered heritage. Marcus was reading, his brow furrowed in concentration just like Richard's had been in old photographs. The weight of tomorrow's board meeting pressed heavily on his mind. His mother had spent the afternoon telling him more about her time with Richard, filling in the gaps of their shared history. She spoke of their dreams for the technology they created together, of the future they had imagined before Thomas's intervention changed everything. "Your father wasn't perfect," she had said, "but he tried to make things right in his own way. The trust he created for you, it wasn't about money. It was about acknowledging the truth, about giving you choices I never had." Now, looking at his children, Jamal understood the true stakes of tomorrow's confrontat.
Ion.
It wasn't just about claiming his birthright or exposing Thomas's manipulation. It was about showing his children that truth matters, that justice is worth fighting for, even when the cost is high. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Thomas is desperate. He's making calls, trying to rally board support. We need to be ready for anything tomorrow." Jamal watched Elena close her laptop, proud of the simple program she had created. He thought about the algorithms his mother had developed, the technology that had helped build an empire. Tomorrow would change everything, their lives, their status, their future. But as he looked at his children, he knew that some things would remain constant. The values he had learned from his mother, the strength he had discovered in himself, and the truth that had waited so long to be told. Sarah's final confrontation with Thomas and Jamal's quiet evening with his family served as the calm before the storm. Tomorrow's board meeting would determine not just the future of Morrison Technologies, but the legacy of two families bound together by genius, love, and long-buried truths. The stage was set for a reckoning that had been 20 years in the making. The Morrison Technologies boardroom buzzed with tension on the morning of the emergency meeting. Board members filled their seats, many shifting uncomfortably as they observed Sarah and Jamal standing together at the front of the room. Thomas sat at the head of the table, his usual polished appearance slightly undone by the shadows under his eyes, suggesting a sleepless night. Sarah began the presentation methodically, laying out the evidence they had gathered. The original patent documents appeared on the large screen behind her, followed by Richard's video testimony. The board members watched in stunned silence as their late CEO confessed to the decisions that had shaped the company's hidden history. "The compression algorithm that built this company," Sarah explained, her voice steady, "was created through the collaborative genius of Richard Morrison and Maria Santos. This isn't just about acknowledging a historical truth. It's about addressing a deliberate suppression of innovation and contribution." Thomas interrupted, standing abruptly. "This is nothing more than a sentimental attempt to rewrite history. Morrison Technologies succeeded because of clear leadership and decisive action. Everything I did was to protect this company's future." "Was that what you were protecting when you blackmailed our father at 15? Sarah countered, bringing up the newspaper clipping from the San Francisco conference. "Or were you protecting yourself, Thomas?
Tell them.
Tell them who you really are." The room fell silent as Thomas's composure finally cracked completely. His laugh held an edge of hysteria.
"Who I really am.
"I'm the one who made the hard choices. I'm the one who understood what was at stake." He turned to face the board members. "Do you think Richard Morrison was the saint his children believe him to be? He had secrets that would have destroyed everything, financial fraud in college, covered up by his wealthy family. I found the proof, and yes, I used it. Because someone had to save this company from his weakness." But that wasn't enough, was it? Jamal spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of generations of buried truth. "You didn't just want to protect the company. You needed to control it completely. Because you're not really Richard Morrison's son at all, are you, Thomas?" The revelation hit the boardroom like a physical force. Thomas's face went white as Patricia Chin entered the room, carrying one final document. "Thomas Morrison was adopted by Richard and his first wife," she announced, placing the adoption papers on the table. A fact he discovered just before the San Francisco conference. His response was to ensure his position through any means necessary, starting with forcing Richard to deny his tie-in-ship with Maria Santos and her son. The truth of Thomas's identity explained decades of actions driven by insecurity and fear. His desperate grasp for control, his determination to bury the past, his obsession with legitimacy, all stemmed from his own buried truth. The board members exchanged glances, decades of company decisions suddenly cast in a new light. Sarah's voice softened with unexpected compassion. You were so afraid of being replaced that you denied others their rightful place. But Father never intended to replace you, Thomas. The trust he created for Jamal wasn't about choosing one son over another. It was about acknowledging all of his children, including you. The weight of this truth seemed to physically age Thomas as he sank back into his chair. Decades of carefully constructed control crumbled around him as the board members began to whisper among themselves. The company's legal counsel stepped forward, speaking quietly but firmly about the need for immediate leadership changes and a full investigation of past decisions. In the aftermath of the revelation, the board voted to suspend Thomas pending a full investigation. Sarah was appointed interim CEO, with a mandate to restructure the company's leadership and address its historical inequities. The trust Richard had created for Jamal was unfrozen, acknowledging both his birthright and his mother's contributions to the company's founding technology. As the boardroom cleared, Jamal found himself standing before his father's portrait, Sarah beside him. The image of Richard Morrison seemed different now, not just a symbol of corporate success, but a man who had tried, however imperfectly, to right the wrongs of his past. What happens now? Jamal asked quietly, thinking of his children, his mother, the life they had known. Sarah smiled, seeing not just her brother but a partner in reshaping their father's legacy. Now we build something new, something honest, a company that honors all its history, not just the convenient parts. The truth had finally emerged, bringing with it not just justice, but the opportunity for healing. Thomas's desperate grasp for control had been rooted in his own painful truth, while Jamal's discovery of his identity had opened doors not just for himself, but for a new generation. In the end, Richard Morrison's legacy would be defined not by the secrets he kept, but by the truths his children chose to acknowledge and the future they would build together.